Hello, everyone, and welcome to our live stream, the new episode in our series on the impact of the pandemic on networks and internet traffic. My name is Alex Pavlovich, and I'm Director of Product Marketing at Nokia Deepfield, part of Nokia focused on IP network intelligence, analytics, and IP network security. Today's session is the world at risk, clear and present danger of distributed denial of service or DDoS. We will talk about the dangers of DDoS and whether we can do something about it. If you have any questions, feel free to enter them in the chat window on the side. We'll do our best to answer them. My guest today is my colleague, Dr. Craig Labovitz, Chief Technology Officer of Nokia Deepfield, a founder of Deepfield, which became part of Nokia IP and Optical Networks in 2017. Craig is a veteran in the industry and has been looking at internet traffic, including DDoS, for more than 25 years. Craig is also a regular speaker at North American Network Operators Group, or NANOG meetings, from NANOG 1, long time ago. Earlier this month, Craig spoke at NANOG 82 and presented the Nokia Deepfield analysis and results, tracing DDoS end-to-end in 2021. Hello, Craig.
Hello.
And welcome. So, Craig, let's start with this interesting topic of DDoS. DDoS attacks are increasing in intensity, frequency, and sophistication. Broadband connectivity and growth of IoT, Internet of Things devices, create a threat potential for high bandwidth, high packet intensity attacks using so-called volumetric DDoS. DDoS attacks have extremely damaging effects on networks, services, and users, from loss of service to loss of vital or mission-critical connectivity to major outages. And there are many types of DDoS. Some work at network level, some operate at the application layer. One type in particular, which I mentioned, volumetric DDoS, poses dangers because of its immense impact on network services and end users. Can you please provide us with a brief introduction to our audience? What is volumetric DDoS, and explain different varieties of volumetric DDoS traffic that you looked at in your study?
Sure. So volumetric DDoS is DDoS that attempts to overwhelm network infrastructure, particularly the routers, the interfaces, the links that connect thousands and tens of thousands of enterprises and millions of consumers to the internet. Volumetric DDoS typically relies, as you mentioned, on the growing number of devices out there that are running outdated software, misconfigured, or otherwise that can be co-opted into DDoS attack. So typically with volumetric DDoS, the attacker just needs a little bit of bandwidth and connectivity, and they can then launch an attack leveraging millions of servers and IoT devices, again, misconfigured across the internet, to overwhelm interfaces, routers, load balancers, and firewalls. And as you mentioned, there are some differences within the types of attacks. The first type of attack is just amplification, and amplification means what the name implies. The ability for the attacker to send a small packet, 40 bytes or so, and leverage all of these misconfigured DNS servers, time servers, SNMP servers, some 30, 40 different types of servers that will respond to a tiny packet and respond back to the victim with not 40 bytes, but tens of megs, in some cases hundreds of megs. The second major type is not necessarily the attacker is amplifying, but because the ability of the attacker to spoof, forge their source address, the attacker can send packets against otherwise normal servers from Google, from Akamai, from Microsoft. And these servers will respond with, in TCP language, a SYNAC, i.e. the servers will be fooled into thinking they're responding to the original requester, but instead they're sending millions of packets to the victim, because again, the source address was spoofed. And finally, with volumetric, we typically see just floods. In this case, again, the third one, the attacker isn't amplifying the traffic, but they are just sending randomized traffic. Often it will be TCP SYN. Normally TCP connections begin with a SYN in the initial sort of connection setup. And the issue is millions of SYNs, particularly millions of different IP addresses, will use up state on firewalls, on load balancers, on different parts of the infrastructure, again, leading to the end customer or customers being disconnected. And finally, though we didn't talk about it as much, botnets are out there. Botnets, though, are not the significant majority of DDoS today. The significant majority of DDoS today leverages the first three, which, as we'll talk about, I suspect later, really relies on hosting. Most of the first three originate out of a small number of hosting providers and generate the significant majority in terms of frequency, bandwidth, and sort of extortion attacks are all from the first three today. And were largely the topic of the Nanog discussion, and I expect our discussion today.
Thanks, Craig. Actually, in your Nanog talk that happened a couple of weeks back, you spoke about the DDoS ecosystem and DDoS for hire or DDoS as a service, where booters and stressors offer their DDoS for hire services. Can you tell us a little bit more about what these are, booters and stressors, and how they work?
Sure. So if you read the popular press or, as it turns out, even academic papers, in the popular imagination, DDoS is coming from elite hackers all over the internet. DDoS is impossible to stop because the hackers have hacked devices and, it's mysterious where DDoS comes from. It turns out most of the conventional wisdom is wrong. It's a myth. If you actually look at DDoS, the vast majority, again, not all, but the vast majority of DDoS is coming from DDoS services. These are about 100 websites, which for give or take $50 a month, will provide a menu of options to attack your favorite enterprise for extortion, your favorite gaming server, or someone in a subscriber network, or a gambling company. So these are websites that advertise, they're available, they accept Bitcoin, they have tens and thousands of customers, raking in millions of dollars per month. Again, hackers aren't out there. The vast majority of websites of DDoS attacks are coming from these small websites. In turn, these 100 or so websites really rely on hosting providers. This isn't every hosting provider. It's not the major commercial hosting providers. Really, it is about 50 providers, 3 or 4 of them in the US, a large number of them in Eastern Europe, a couple in Asia, where the booter or stressor services, i.e. boot people off the internet, are relying on these hosting services. And, it's kind of interesting. All of the booter sites typically look pretty similar. The booter sites will offer a range of plans from $50 to $1,000 a month, depending on the sophistication of the attack. The booter sites happily will allow you to spoof where the traffic comes from. So, for example, you can specify you want your attack to appear to come from Google, or from Microsoft, or from Cloudflare. And typically will offer a range of services and dedicated servers which you can use. So again, most of DDoS is not coming from elite hackers. Most DDoS is coming from relatively user-friendly DDoS stressors or booter sites. So, as I mentioned earlier, most of them advertise quite openly. They will advertise 2 terabit attacks. They will advertise they're the best booter on the planet. Again, it is a relatively well fleshed out ecosystem with pretty good UX, UI, and as it turns out, pretty good customer service as well.
How easy is to tell, these providers or ecosystem where they're coming from? Are those hosting companies deliberately created to help malicious players exploiting DDoS, or what did you find?
Yeah, so we really found, I think, 3 categories. In the first category, like privacy servers and others that we mentioned in the Nanog talk, openly advertise. They market, they advertise, they buy advertising space on different sort of black hat websites, and they're quite open that spoofing is enabled, DDoS is allowed. Typically, they'll also offer other what we call bulletproof, i.e. if you want to host copyright content, that's fine too. Adult content, any type of illegal content, they'll happily host that. So maybe about half of the DDoS hosting providers are absolutely out in the open. and will very explicit about what they do. Again, typically in gray area jurisdictions, i.e. Eastern Europe and others that don't have the same sort of legal enforcement that you might find, for example, in North America. The second category are, I think hosting that tries to hide itself. And typically it's hiding itself in layers. Most hosting on the internet today is resold. In the case of IPHM or IP header modification or spoofing, you typically can have 2 or 3 layers of reselling. Often the bottom layers are reputable businesses on which they have 2 or 3 layers of increasingly less reputable businesses all reselling the same hardware. Though, and often, by the way, they all share the same ownership. So they're actually all the same company. They're just different, sort of brands within the same ownership structure. So with these websites, typically they may not advertise as openly. Typically, for example, they may not actually say DDoS or spoofing allowed directly on the web page, but they do have those in their search terms buried in the source. So Google and others, if you search for spoofing or DDoS, you'll find these websites. And for at least 3 of these, they are actually DDoS mitigation companies, i.e. companies that advertise they will provide DDoS mitigation services. And it turns out 3 of the top DDoS mitigation services are also 3 of the top sources of DDoS attacks on the internet, in what I can only presume is a conflict of interest.
That's an interesting business model. Thanks. Let's move on to the sizing of the problem. How big volumetric DDoS is today? What dangers does it pose to service providers? Can you give us an idea? You've done some, evaluation, estimation of even the potential threat.
Sure. So just to frame the problem, most consumers or enterprises probably have a gig, maybe 10 gig of connectivity to the internet. The largest reported attacks today have ranged 2 to 3 terabits. Again, not every attack is reported, but generally what at least is publicly reported is 2 to 3 terabits, sort of the high watermark for attacks, and certainly more than enough to interrupt service to any gigabit or even 10 gig or 100 gig customer. So really significant attacks that in the past 2 to 3 terabits were rare. We're now seeing that capacity, certainly every day, we're seeing that volume of attack traffic somewhere in the internet. But I think one of the major findings of our study was to measure what is the overall aggregate capacity largely coming out of these DDoS hosting. And when you look at the millions of packets per second that they can generate as we measure it, you don't get 2 to 3, you are getting 10 to even larger, 30 and higher terabits per second. So 3 to 10 times larger than any attacks we see today. We're measuring the potential. Again, not all directed at one customer today, but as we measure the potential, it is significantly larger than the most significant attacks reported. And as we discuss in the NANOG presentation, none of this is getting better. These numbers all doubled over the last year and will likely double again in the upcoming or throughout this year. Again, far outpacing any other application, any other type of traffic on the internet, really posing an existential threat as this traffic can continue unchecked.
You mentioned that this is an economic challenge between service providers and low barrier to entry or easy access to DDoS for hire services. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, as I mentioned in the NANOG presentation, I think the industry and the community, service providers and enterprise now have a range of hardware and vendors that can mitigate DDoS. The technical problem has largely been addressed. The issue now is largely one of economics. What is the cost to be able to mitigate? What is the OpEx? What is the CapEx? And the challenge is if it costs you $50 per month to launch however many DDoS you want, unlimited plan, and for 1 out of 10 DDoS you can get 10,000, 20,000, whatever in extortion. that's an arbitrage opportunity. And that is just massive amount of money flowing into the ecosystem where it might cost the defenders, whether it be the service provider or the enterprise, thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of dollars to defend. So largely, we are concerned about the economic disparity between the attacker and the defender, largely being problematic as the internet continues to expand, services continue, and the criticality of services continues to increase. So we really, in the Nanog presentation, talk about two sides. One is we need to do a better job as an industry of going after these 50 or so hosting providers. Again, it's absolutely a myth that DDoS is elite hackers coming from all over the internet. It's not. It is a small number of websites and an even smaller number of hosting providers. And Nokia is working with both other vendors and the ISPs and some of the hosting providers identified in our study to try to address the problem closer to the actual source of the attacks. Given that that will never be fully successful, the second half of this is how can we dramatically change the economics of protecting DDoS? And largely the plan or the projects we've been working on at Nokia, as well as sharing some of the technology and discussions with ITF and others, is that it largely is moving away from dedicated appliances, really expensive custom-built hardware to address DDoS. Largely, we've been able to leverage, both from Nokia, but also from other vendors, leverage production routers deployed today with a little bit of analytics and software and some of the analysis that we've been doing. You can largely use most commercial routers today to block the vast majority of DDoS directly on the routers. And again, the reason that this is important is this is an order of magnitude change in the economics of DDoS protection. Using existing hardware is obviously a dramatically different price than buying custom inline multi-terabit capacity on custom ASIC. So this is the second half of how we argue the growing DDoS problem needs to be addressed.
So can you just give us a snapshot of different approaches to user security, including legacy approaches, and why they are failing? I hear this is also a matter of technology, but also economic argument. So just to give us just a choice of options here, what are we talking about when we talk about different options of taming DDoS with technology?
Yeah, so I think there's really several main approaches today. One is certainly CDN, content distribution networks, and cloud makes sense for a lot of content that are just hosted and live in the cloud. The issue is that not all content lives in the cloud. Not all enterprises are fully in the cloud. Certainly subscribers and enterprises need to connect to the cloud through ISP links and business links. So largely for the content that is not cloud-based and the hundreds and thousands of subscribers and enterprises under attack that aren't in the cloud, it really is two options. One is buying service from a upstream provider, your internet provider. Typically, it is a service that can be relatively expensive because, again, custom hardware is expensive. Largely, in many of these services, it's not completely automated. So people responding to DDoS is expensive. The option where we've been working and now are in production with a number of customers is leveraging their existing routers. It's leveraging the existing routers to be able to quickly instantiate the filters and also largely to do it with automation. So again, expensive security operations center, dozens of people on staff to respond to DDoS no longer required. Largely, the network can defend itself, and it can defend itself with a high degree of economic scale and is extremely performant in terms of the ability to quickly block the DDoS and ensure that good traffic continues through.
Thanks. Let me just go back to your study for a second. I understand the key findings are the threat potential is great, even greater than the largest attacks we have today. But the good news is that pretty much the origins of DDoS on the net are kind of localized. We see fewer than 50 companies, hosting providers that generate most of this traffic by frequency and by volume. So I'm quite eager to share some of your methodology with this audience. Because this is not a non-trivial task to go and look for IP spoof traffic, or as you call it, IPHM, header modified traffic, all the way back to their origins. So you did some interesting, steps along the way, fingerprinting booters and IPHM hosting companies, detecting IPHM or spoofed IP, and then tracing it across the internet in real time. Can you give us an idea of of these steps and what they entailed? I know that you shared some of that methodology at NANOG, and you will be sharing at upcoming ITF meetings. But just for this audience here to give us a glimpse into how difficult it was to put all this big picture together, because from what I understand, we are able to see a lot of traffic coming from amplifiers, but to go beyond amplifiers is really a step that is not done or hasn't been done yet or so far.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question, Alex. Yeah, this was a lot of work. And in particular, as you noted, most analysis of DDoS only stops at the amplifiers. Most analysis of DDoS in the past has basically concluded that DDoS is unstoppable because it's hidden behind amplifiers. You can never trace it back, and it is coming from too many places on the internet to stop. So we really focused on really several steps. One is, can we actually use commercial software, Nokia commercial software collaboration with providers to actually not just look at the victim, but fingerprint that attack? And again, ITF and other have some fingerprint initiatives, which this shares some similarity with, and trace it back from the victim to the amplifiers and take it a step further back to the closest internet entry point that we can find. In about 40 to 50% of the cases, we were able to identify, just using these steps, the specific hosting provider that was providing safe haven for, again, these services, these illegal services. We wanted, though, to be able to narrow down the search for the remaining 50% of the traffic. So for the remaining 50% of the traffic, to narrow down where it was coming from, we took a couple of steps. The first step is we obtained accounts on basically every DDoS service we could find. We spent days and hours reading black hat lists and Telegram messages and negotiating, but we ended up with accounts on basically, as far as we can tell, the majority of all of these both booter stressor websites, as well as we identified as many as we could find on the IPHM, the actual hosting provider side. And with these accounts, we actually took fingerprints. We took TCP dump and PCAPs and understood what amplifiers they were using, what DNS payloads they were using, which NTP servers, which ICMP, and where they were doing other measurements during the attack. So really taking a broad range of measurements of both the hosting and the booter stressor illegal DDoS services. We then also took another step of leveraging techniques and sort of algorithms or queries that we provided at NANOG of being able to search for these signatures in DDoS attacks across the internet and greatly narrowed down where we believed this traffic was originating. Again, traffic that, at least before I think our work, was largely hidden behind reflectors or amplifiers. And as I said earlier, largely the data somewhat surprised us. Contrary to the conventional wisdom that DDoS comes from everywhere and is unstoppable, it is a tiny number of hosting providers that are actually providing safe haven for these services, and a relatively small 100 or so number of booter or stressors. The number, in fact, may even be smaller. One of the challenges, of course, is that many of these are the same company. As mentioned earlier, it is often challenging to disentangle the layers of reseller and ties between some of these providers. But it is a small number of both booter stressor services as well as hosting that are largely fueling the DDoS ecosystem.
Thanks. In your NANOC talk, you also mentioned that you solved a few mysteries along the way. Can you please, for this audience, share some of those mysteries? And I know that one question was also coming up as a follow-up by media and by analysts on your threat potential estimate of 10 or over 10 terabits per second. So how did you arrive to that number? And is it a real threat potential out there? But also some of those other mysteries that mystified you. So I know you've spent quite a long time working on internet traffic and DDoS. Has anything surprised you in this analysis that you found?
Yeah, I think there are several mysteries, though in some way they're all the same mystery. And specifically, when we looked at the DDoS traffic, the traffic going out of this bad actor hosting, out of these 50 sites to the internet, the traffic didn't always make sense to us. Insofar as Nokia maintains through something we call our genome, where we do massive internet scale crawling and identification of threats, we maintain our own list of every IP address, every v4, every v6 on the internet, every IP that's ever been used in a DDoS attack, every misconfigured IoT device on the internet. So we have a pretty good database of every IP. We have a pretty good idea of what we would expect to see when DDoS attackers are trying to abuse these IoT devices. And what was striking is that the IPs don't match. The IPs we saw from the attackers made no sense. They were sending tons of traffic to IoT devices that hadn't been connected to the internet in months, in some cases years. And we also didn't understand why, when we measured the amount of forged traffic, particularly packets per second, that the attackers out of these 50 hosting sites could generate, it was 3 to 5 to 10, possibly even larger, the amount of DDoS potential than the highest attacks ever reported. So it turns out these mysteries are related. It turns out that as you analyze all of these attacks, most of them are done poorly. The vast majority of them are using outdated amplifier lists, i.e. their lists of IoT devices and others are in some cases months, in some cases years old. And, it is at least one explanation for why the attacks we're seeing so far, we're getting lucky. We're getting lucky that mostly DDoS is done poorly, and that the DDoS potential is not efficiently using the existing attack vectors. I'll say largely, it also is, I think, challenging to come up with an overall estimate. We can estimate the number of packets per second coming out of spoofing. We know the number of amplifiers out on the internet. Unfortunately, it's hard to do tests in the wild, right? Unlike the hackers, we're not actually going to send traffic. So it is a fairly broad range of what can the amplifiers actually produce. And some of the amplifiers share the same upstream, so there's limits on capacity. So the number we ended up with was at least 10 to 15 terabit is the potential. It may in fact be quite larger, but again, it is something very difficult to measure because we obviously are not going to do tests actually using these amplifiers in the wild to understand the full potential. So it may be even another 2 or 3 times that size.
Thanks. Still, you're very optimistic. You mentioned that a fair number of advanced routers, production routers used in live networks today can be used to mitigate this most dangerous type of volumetric DDoS. And so the DDoS can be effectively stopped. What gives you this confidence today as opposed to 10 years ago or 15 years ago?
Yeah, I wish it was just 15 years ago. It's been maybe 20, 25 years. But be that as it may, when I started my career, when I started working on DDoS, routers by comparison were primitive. The entire focus of routers was just speeds and feeds. How fast and how cheaply can you switch packets? The management, the telemetry, the filter capability of all vendors was minimal or non-existent. And in fact, it was quite dangerous in the past to try to use a router for anything but just forwarding packets, i.e. unexpected limits on filter size, unexpected hits to forwarding rates, unpredictability, just lack of maturity overall. And that certainly was the case for most of the internet's history, at least going back 25 years. But over the last 10 years, there has been a massive maturation of the market. Certainly Nokia, and I tend to think we're leading the way, but also of other vendors, where there is tremendous focus today on object-oriented model-based management, NetConf, on telemetry, gRPC. We're finally, after 30 years, replacing SNMP. But huge capabilities, and the underlying ASIC for the forwarding cards has gotten so much better in terms of reliability and the ability to filter. So we've gone from a world where no one wanted to ever touch their routers or consider their routers in terms of any security model to where most commercial routers deployed today, again, it differs in terms of scale and capability, but most commercial routers today actually can be used to block the vast majority of DDoS directly on the ASIC. And again, this is a massive game changer for the economics of defending against DDoS for both ISP and enterprise.
Thanks. Routers are one part of big picture of solving DDoS. In Nokia Deepfield, let's talk about Nokia DDoS solution for a second. We combine big data analytics coming from Deepfield, namely Deepfield Defender, which is our big IP security analytics platform. And then we also have Deepfield Secure Genome, which you mentioned, which is our data feeds that we obtain from the internet and pass to our customer deployments. It has additional internet security context that really improves accuracy of detection of DDoS traffic. So obviously, in this virtuous circle or loop between big data analytics and routers, advanced devices that can do mitigation and also help with the detection of DDoS traffic, we see the need for automation. So we also have features such as auto mitigation, the ability to start mitigation once the DDoS traffic is detected automatically. How important is automation in the world of DDoS security?
Yeah, as I said earlier, largely I think this is an economic problem. And if you have security operations staff just watching for DDoS and manually trying to fight DDoS, it is a very different scale than what you can achieve with automation. I think it's also the recognition that latency is king, right? DDoS attacks are no longer the rare birds they were 20 years ago. These are things that are occurring dozens, hundreds, thousands of times in different networks per day. It is just become so cheap, so easy with all these web services to launch these attacks that manual response just doesn't scale. And even if you could hire a large enough team, seconds matter now for gamers, for web hosting. So it really is, can you get to sub-second response? And can you do it on a scale that is economically as well as technically a match for the attackers? And that's largely why we've been focused on closed loop automation, automatically mapping the internet to identify threats via genome, automatically understanding normal traffic patterns, building, again, using genome to build models of the network, automatically detecting DDoS threats with 99 or higher % accuracy. And obviously, as we've discussed, being able to automatically install filters on the routers themselves and monitor those filters throughout the life cycle of the attack. So really an entire life cycle, being able to automatically respond to what we have measured as a significantly growing DDoS threat.
Thanks. Is there any other advice apart from those that you shared with Nanog and you will share with ITF community, that you can offer to our audience here, especially to the service providers, cloud builders, large digital enterprises, and all others, regulators, users, internet community at large, all of us who have a shared interest in making the internet a safer place and fighting and stopping DDoS?
Yeah, as I said, a lot of this work is born out of the frustration in that I'm having the same conversations about the same attacks I had 25, 30 years ago. And, it is starting to dawn on me that unless we make a change, I'll end my career having these same conversations. But largely the big takeaway, I think, from this work is that DDoS is not this mysterious threat spread across the internet. DDoS is not something that requires esoteric hardware to block. I think the good news is we have an opportunity to block a significant portion of the DDoS traffic pretty close to the source as we work with internet providers and provide the algorithms to detect this where it originates. And we have the opportunity to leverage routers to radically change the economics on the victim side for at least the remainder of traffic that we can't block. So I think the good news is I am hoping I don't have to have this conversation again in 10 years from now, and that we really are at a point in the industry where we can block the vast majority of this traffic. Because again, this is an existential threat to the continued growth of the internet unless we take a firmer stance, both with technology, policy, with customers, and to block this type of traffic on the internet.
Many thanks. Thanks, Craig, for your time and sharing these valuable insights into the world of distributed denial of service, or DDoS. The audience, we hope that this session was informative and useful to you. Thank you for staying with us in this live stream. And also big thanks to the support team who has been showing the slides and responding to questions in the chat window. Please check out the links we provided in the chat window, and we also the link at the very end of this presentation. Visit our webpage, nokia.com/deepfield, or ask your local Nokia representative for additional information, a custom presentation, or a demo. Looking forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you and goodbye.